In the shadowy grandeur of Devereux Hall, a grand ball turns deadly when financier Alphonse Devereux is stabbed in the heart during a haunting waltz. Hercule Poirot, the brilliant detective, steps into a web of secrets where a hidden dagger, a cryptic code, and a scent of lavender unravel a tale of betrayal and revenge. A scorned niece, a vengeful rival, a fearful composer, and a sorrowful widowage holds a piece of the truth. As Poirot dances through clues, a shocking confession reveals a murder driven by love and loss. Can he unmask the killer before the final note fades? Chapter 1. The Invitation in the heart of London, where the fog clung to the cobblestones like a conspirator's cloak. Hercule Poirot sat in the pristine order of his flat at Whitehaven Mansions. The room was a study in symmetry. The polished mahogany desk, the neatly arranged books, the silver coffee service gleaming under the soft glow of a crystal lamp. Every detail, from the alignment of his pens to the precise angle of his armchair, reflected the fastidious mind of the little Belgian detective. His moustache, a masterpiece of waxed precision, twitched slightly as he surveyed the morning's correspondence, delivered with the punctuality he so admired by his landlady, Mrs. Hudson. The post was, as usual, a collection of the mundane and the intriguing. Bills, a letter from a grateful client, and an invitation to a lecture on criminal psychology at the Royal Society, all sorted with the efficiency of a man who believed that order was the foundation of truth. But one envelope, lying atop the pile like a jewel in a crown, arrested his attention. It was of heavy cream paper, embossed with a crest, a stylized rose entwined with a serpent, unfamiliar yet suggestive of old wealth. The address was penned in an elegant, almost ostentatious hand, and the wax seal bore the same crest, pressed with deliberate care. Poirot's small, manicured hands lifted the envelope with the reverence one might afford a rare manuscript. He broke the seal and extracted a single sheet, its contents written in ink so black it seemed to absorb the light. The letter read, "Monsieur Hercule Poirot, your reputation as a man of unparalleled discernment precedes you. I, Alphonse Devereux, humbly request your presence at Devereux Hall, my estate in the county of Sussex, for a grand ball to be held on the evening of the 15th inst. The occasion is one of celebration, but also of some delicacy, requiring a mind such as yours. Your discretion, and perhaps your expertise, would be most valued. I trust you will honor me with your attendance. A car will be sent to collect you at noon on the appointed day. Yours sincerely." Alphonse Devereux. Poirot's green eyes gleamed with interest. Alphonse Devereux was a name that carried weight, though not without shadow. A financier of French descent, he had amassed a fortune in the city before retreating to his ancestral estate, where he lived in near seclusion. Whispers in London's drawing rooms spoke of his brilliance in matters of commerce, but also of a temperament both secretive and imperious. Why, Poirot wondered, would such a man summon a detective to a ball? And what was this matter of some delicacy that required his particular skills? "Mon ami Hastings," Poirot called, his voice crisp yet tinged with excitement. Captain Arthur Hastings, his loyal friend and occasional chronicler, looked up from the armchair where he was engrossed in the sporting pages of the Times. His honest, open face, so quintessentially English, bore a look of mild surprise. "Hastings, we are invited to a most curious affair. A ball, no less, at the home of Monsieur Alphonse Devereux. Pack your evening attire, for we depart tomorrow." Hastings folded his paper, his brow furrowing. Devereux, the financier chap. Bit of a recluse, isn't he? Why is he throwing a ball, and why on earth does he want you there?" Poirot smiled, his moustache curving upward like the wings of a contented bird. "That, my dear Hastings, is precisely what intrigues me. The letter speaks of delicacy, of a need for discretion. It is not merely an invitation, it is a summons. And Hercule Poirot does not ignore a summons that promises a puzzle." Hastings, ever practical, leaned back in his chair. "Sounds like a rum business. Do you know much about this Devereux fellow?" "Only what the world whispers," Poirot replied, tapping the letter against his chin. "He is a man of wealth, yes, but also of mystery. His fortune was built on bold ventures, railways, shipping, perhaps even less savory dealings, if the rumors are to be believed. Yet he has not been seen in London society for years. Why now, Hastings? Why a ball, and why me? Perhaps he's just keen on your dancing skills," Hastings said with a grin, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. "You do cut a fine figure in a waltz, old man." Poirot's expression was one of mock indignation. "The waltz, Hastings, is a matter of precision, of balanced qualities I possess in abundance. But system, abundance. But dancing is not detecting, and detecting is my purpose here." He paused, his gaze returning to the letter. "We shall see what Monsieur Devereux requires of Hercule Poirot." The following morning, as the clock struck noon, a sleek black Rolls-Royce arrived at Whitehaven Mansions. The driver, a taciturn man with a scar across his left cheek, introduced himself as Grayson, the butler of Devereux Hall. His manner was formal, his eyes sharp, and Poirot noted the slight tension in his posture as he opened the car door. The journey to Sussex was a long one, through mist-shrouded lanes and rolling hills, the landscape growing wilder as they approached the coast. Hastings, ever the enthusiast for the English countryside, remarked on the beauty of the scenery. But Poirot's attention remained fixed on the road ahead, his mind turning over the possibilities of Devereux's invitation. Devereux Hall loomed into view as the car crested a hill, a vast Gothic pile of stone and spires that seemed to grow out of the earth itself. Its windows glowed faintly in the afternoon light, and its towers cast long shadows across the manicured lawns. The air carried the scent of salt from the nearby sea, mingling with the fragrance of late roses in the garden. As the car rolled to a stop at the grand entrance, Poirot felt a prickle of anticipation. This was no ordinary country house, and its master was no ordinary man. Grayson led them into a cavernous hall, its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The air was cool, scented with wax polish and old wood, and the faint hum of activity suggested preparations for the evening's event. A maid, young and nervous, took their coats, her eyes darting toward Grayson as if seeking approval. The butler's authority was evident, yet there was something in his demeanor of wariness. Perhaps that piqued Poirot's curiosity. Monsieur Alphonse Devereux descended the grand staircase with the measured grace of a man accustomed to command. He was tall, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead, and his blue eyes held a piercing intensity. His evening suit was impeccably tailored, though Poirot noted a slight tremor in the hand that gripped the banister. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice smooth with a faint French accent, "I am honored you have accepted my invitation, and Captain Hastings, a pleasure." "The honor is mine," Monsieur Devereux Poirot replied, bowing slightly. "Your letter was most intriguing. I am, as you say, a man of discernment, and I sense there is more to this ball than mere festivity." Devereux's smile was enigmatic, revealing nothing. "You are perceptive, as expected. Come, let me show you too. Your rooms. We will speak privately before the evening begins." He gestured to Grayson, who led them up the staircase to a pair of adjoining rooms overlooking the gardens. The accommodations were luxurious, with heavy velvet curtains and furniture that spoke of centuries-old wealth. Poirot's room contained a small writing desk, a detail he approved of, and a vase of fresh lavender that filled the air with its delicate scent. As Hastings unpacked, Poirot stood at the window, gazing out at the rolling lawns and the distant shimmer of the sea. "This place, Hastings," he murmured. "It is a stage, and we are about to witness a drama. But what kind, I wonder?" "Sounds like you're expecting trouble," Hastings said, hanging his evening jacket in the wardrobe. "You don't think this is just a social call, do you?" "Non, mon ami," Poirot said, turning from the window. "A man like Devereux does not summon Hercule Poirot for idle amusement. There is a purpose here, and it is one of secrets." An hour later, they were summoned to Devereux's private study, a room lined with books and dominated by a massive oak desk. The financier sat behind it, a glass of brandy in his hand, his expression unreadable. "Monsieur Poirot," he began, "I will be frank. I have reason to believe that someone among my guests tonight intends me harm. I cannot say more without evidence, but I trust your presence will clarify matters." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "You suspect a crime, monsieur?" "I suspect many things," Devereux replied, his voice low. "My life has been one of calculated risks, and I have made enemies. Some of them will be here tonight. I ask only that you observe, that you use those remarkable little grey cells of yours to see what I cannot." "And who are these guests?" Poirot asked, his tone mild but his eyes sharp. Devereux listed them with the precision of a man accustomed to memorizing details. His niece, Claire Beaumont, a young woman estranged from him for years. Sir Reginald Holt, a business rival with a grudge. Victor Langston, a composer whose music Devereux had commissioned. And Madame Elise Fournier, the widow of his late business partner. "A small gathering," Devereux said, "but each has their reasons to resent me." Poirot nodded, his mind already sorting through the possibilities. "And you, monsieur, what is it you fear? A theft? A scandal?" Devereux's eyes darkened. "Something more permanent, perhaps." He rose, signaling the end of the conversation. "We will dine at 6, and the ball begins at 8. I trust you will find everything to your satisfaction." As they left the study, Hastings whispered, "He's a bit dramatic, isn't he? All this talk of enemies and permanent harm sounds like something out of a novel." "Life, Hastings," Poirot said, "is often more dramatic than fiction, and I suspect Monsieur Devereux knows this all too well." The dining room was a spectacle of opulence, its long table set with silver and crystal that sparkled under the chandelier. The other guests were already seated, and Poirot took their measure with a single glance. Claire Beaumont was a striking woman in her late 20s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that held a guarded intensity. Her green silk dress was elegant, but understated, and she sat with a posture that suggested defiance. Sir Reginald Holt, a burly man with a florid face and a loud laugh, exuded the confidence of wealth, though his eyes were cold and calculating. Victor Langston, young and pale, fidgeted with his napkin, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he glanced nervously around the table. Madame Elise Fournier, dressed in mourning black, had a serene beauty marred by a faint air of melancholy. Her gaze lingered on Devereux, who sat at the head of the table, his expression inscrutable. The meal was a delicate affair: consomme, roasted pheasant, and a lemon sorbet that Poirot approved of heartily. But the conversation was strained. Claire spoke little, her responses to Devereux's inquiries curt and formal. Sir Reginald dominated the table with tales of his business ventures, each story laced with a subtle jab at Devereux's past dealings. Victor murmured something about his music, his voice barely audible, while Madame Fournier offered polite remarks in a soft French accent. Poirot, ever the observer, noted the undercurrents of tension, the unspoken resentments that flickered in glances and pauses after dinner. As the guests retired to prepare for the ball, Poirot lingered in the dining room, examining a portrait of a stern-faced woman above the fireplace. Madame Devereux, perhaps, he mused aloud. Grayson, clearing the table, nodded. The late Madame Devereux, sir. She passed some years ago, a great loss to the master. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And Monsieur Devereux has not remarried? No. Sir, Grayson said, his voice flat. He has other priorities. The ball was to be held in the grand ballroom, a vast chamber with polished parquet floors and towering windows that opened onto a terrace overlooking the sea. The chandeliers cast a warm golden light, and a small orchestra tuned their instruments in a corner. Poirot, resplendent in his evening attire, adjusted his cufflinks and surveyed the room. The decorations were lavish, yet tasteful, of roses, silver candelabras, and a long table laden with champagne and delicacies. Everything was perfect, yet Poirot felt a chill of unease. The stage was set, but for what? As the guests began to arrive, Poirot positioned himself near a marble pillar, his eyes scanning the crowd. Claire entered first, her expression tight, her locket glinting at her throat. Sir Reginald followed, his cane tapping the floor, his laughter echoing. Victor slipped in quietly, his hands clasped tightly together, while Madame Fournier glided in like a shadow, her lavender-scented gloves catching Poirot's attention. Devereux himself appeared last, his presence commanding the room. He raised a glass, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. My friends, he said, tonight we celebrate life, beauty, and the music of the soul. Let us dance. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and the room came alive with movement. Poirot watched, his mind a whirl of observations. The stiffness of Claire's posture, the calculation in Sir Reginald's smile, the tremor in Victor's hands, the intensity of Madame Fournier's gaze, and Devereux, at the center of it all, moved with a grace that belied his age, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something or someone. Hastings, Poirot said softly, this is no ordinary ball. There is a shadow here, and it grows darker with every step. Hastings, sipping champagne, frowned. You're awfully grim, Poirot. It's just a dance, isn't it? No, mon ami, Poirot replied, his voice barely above a whisper. It is the prelude to a crime. The waltz continued, its lilting melody filling the air. But Poirot's little grey cells were already at work, piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that had yet to fully reveal itself. The invitation, the guests, the cryptic warning all pointed to a truth hidden in plain sight, and Hercule Poirot was determined to uncover it before the final note was played. Chapter 2. Devereux Hall. The Rolls-Royce crunched along the gravel drive, its tires whispering secrets to the stones as it approached Devereux Hall. Hercule Poirot, seated beside Captain Hastings, gazed out at the estate unfolding before them, his sharp green eyes absorbing every detail with the precision of a watchmaker. The Sussex countryside, with its undulating hills and patches of heather, had given way to a scene of imposing grandeur. The hall itself was a monument to another age, its Gothic spires piercing the low clouds, its stone facade weathered yet defiant against the sea winds that swept in from the nearby coast. Ivy clung to its walls like a jealous lover, and the windows, tall and narrow, glinted with the last light of the afternoon, as though guarding secrets within. Grayson, the butler, opened the car door with a deference that bordered on mechanical. His scar, a jagged line across his left cheek, seemed to tighten as he met Poirot's gaze. "Welcome to Devereux Hall, Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," he said, his voice smooth but carrying a faint undercurrent of strain. Poirot noted the man's hands gloved in white, and the slight rigidity in his posture, as if he were bracing for an unseen blow. The butler led them through the great oak doors into a cavernous entrance hall, where the air was cool and scented with the must of old wood and the sharp Thames of beeswax. The hall was a gallery of time. Portraits of Devereux ancestors lined the walls, their eyes following the visitors with silent judgment. A chandelier, its crystals catching the light like frozen tears, hung above a marble floor inlaid with a mosaic of roses and serpents, the same crest Poirot had seen on the invitation. Servants moved with quiet efficiency, their footsteps muffled by thick rugs, their faces betraying nothing but the occasional flicker of curiosity as they glanced at the famous detective. A young maid, her apron starched to perfection, took their coats, her hands trembling slightly as she avoided Grayson's watchful eye. "Mon ami," Poirot murmured to Hastings as they ascended the grand staircase. "This house, it is like a stage set for a tragedy. The players are assembling, but the script remains hidden." Hastings, clutching his hat, looked around with a mixture of awe and unease. "It's a bit grim, isn't it? All this stone and gloom. Makes you wonder what Devereux's hiding in a place like this." "Everything, Hastings," Poirot replied softly. "A man who lives in such a fortress does not invite strangers without purpose." Their rooms were on the second floor, overlooking a formal garden where topiary hedges stood like sentinels in the fading light. Poirot's chamber was a study in understated opulence. A four-poster bed draped in burgundy velvet, a fireplace with a carved mantel, and a small writing desk bearing a vase of lavender that filled the air with its soothing fragrance. The detective paused to adjust the vase, aligning it precisely with the edge of the desk. "Order, Hastings," he said, catching his friend's amused glance, "is the foundation of clarity." Hastings's room, adjacent, was equally luxurious, though he remarked with a chuckle that the heavy curtains made him feel like a character in a Gothic novel. "I half expect a ghost to pop out of the wardrobe," he said, tossing his suitcase onto the bed. "Ghosts, Nan," Poirot said, his mustache twitching. "But secrets, those are more dangerous, and I suspect this house is full of them." Their arrival had coincided with the final preparations for the ball, and the house hummed with activity. From the window, Poirot observed servants carrying trays of crystal glasses and silver candelabras toward the ballroom, their movements choreographed with military precision. A gardener trimmed a rosebush with meticulous care, while a footman polished the brass handles of the terrace doors. Everything was in its place, yet Poirot's little grey cells stirred with the sense that something was amiss, a note out of tune in this otherwise perfect symphony. At 5:30, Grayson appeared to escort them to Devereux's study for a private audience before dinner. The study was a sanctuary of intellect and power, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and maps of distant continents. A massive oak desk dominated the room, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a curious bronze statuette of a dancer frozen mid-waltz. Alphonse Devereux stood by a window, his silhouette framed against the stormy sky, his silver hair catching the light like a halo. He turned as they entered, his blue eyes sharp and assessing, though Poirot noted again the faint tremor in his hand as he gestured to two chairs. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, thank you for coming," Devereux said, his voice carrying the polished cadence of a man who had navigated boardrooms and ballrooms with equal ease. "I trust your journey was comfortable." "Most comfortable," Monsieur Poirot replied, seating himself with a small bow. "But I confess, it is not the journey that occupies my thoughts. Your letter spoke of a matter of delicacy. Perhaps you might enlighten me further." Devereux's smile was thin, almost reluctant. "You are direct, Monsieur Poirot, as I expected. Very well. Tonight's ball is more than a social occasion. It is a reckoning of sorts. I have invited certain individuals guests whose presence is not entirely for pleasure. I have reason to believe that one among them harbors ill intent toward me." Hastings leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Ill intent? You mean someone's planning to do you harm?" Devereux's gaze flickered to the window, where the first drops of rain began to patter against the glass. "Harm, yes. Or worse. I cannot say more without proof, but I have learned to trust my instincts. They have kept me alive in a world full of wolves." Poirot's fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression one of calm curiosity. "And these guests, monsieur? Who are they, and what is their connection to you?" Devereux crossed to his desk, picking up a small leather notebook. "My niece, Claire Beaumont, whom I have not seen in years. She believes I wronged her, though she does not know the full truth. Sir Reginald Holt, a man whose business ventures I once outmaneuvered. He does not forgive easily. Victor Langston, a young composer whose talent I admire, but whose loyalty I question. And Madame Elise Fournier, the widow of my late partner, whose grief I fear has turned to bitterness." Poirot's eyes gleamed, a fascinating ensemble. "And you believe one of them means to act against you tonight?" "I believe," Devereux said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "that this ball will bring certain truths to light. Ask only that you watch Monsieur Poirot. Your reputation for seeing what others miss is why you are here." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock, and Grayson entered to announce that dinner would be served shortly. Devereux dismissed them with a nod, but as Poirot rose, he paused by the bronze statuette, its delicate form catching his eye. "A fine piece," he remarked. "A dancer, yes." Devereux's expression softened briefly. "A gift from my late wife. She loved to dance. This ball, in a way, is in her memory." Outside the study, Hastings let out a low whistle. "He's a queer one, Poirot. All this talk of enemies and reckonings. Do you think he's in real danger, or is he just being theatrical?" Poirot adjusted his tie, his reflection in a nearby mirror catching his meticulous eye. "Theatrical, perhaps, but sincere. A man does not summon Hercule Poirot for a mere whim. There is danger here, Hastings, and it wears the mask of civility." Dinner was served in a dining room that rivaled the grandeur of the ballroom. The table, set for 8, gleamed with silver and crystal, and a massive chandelier cast a warm glow over the scene. The guests were already seated when Poirot and Hastings entered, and the detective took the opportunity to study them. Claire Beaumont, in a dress of midnight blue, sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on her plate. Sir Reginald Holt, his face ruddy from wine, laughed loudly at his own jest, though his gaze darted toward Devereux with a hint of malice. Victor Langston, pale and slight, toyed with his fork, his nervous energy almost palpable. Madame Elise Fournier, her black gown stark against her pale skin, exuded a quiet dignity, though her eyes held a depth of sorrow that intrigued Poirot. Devereux presided over the table like a king, his manner gracious but distant. The Milesters, followed by a delicate sole, Moyniere, and a raspberry tart, was exquisite. But the conversation was stilted. Claire spoke only when addressed, her responses sharp and guarded. Sir Reginald recounted a recent trip to Paris, his voice booming, while Victor murmured something about the waltz he had composed for the ball. Madame Fournier offered little beyond polite acknowledgments, though Poirot noted the way her fingers lingered on her wineglass, as if seeking comfort. As the meal drew to a close, Devereux rose, tapping his glass with a spoon. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Tonight is a celebration of life, of music, of the ties that bind us. But it is also a night for truth. I urge you to dance, to laugh, and to remember that nothing remains hidden forever." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Poirot's gaze swept the table, catching the flicker of unease in Claire's eyes, the tightening of Sir Reginald's jaw, the sudden stillness of Victor's hands, and the faint flush on Madame Fournier's cheeks. The stage was set, the players in place, and the curtain about to rise on a drama that Poirot sensed would end in blood. As the guests dispersed to prepare for the ball, Poirot lingered by the dining room's fireplace, his fingers brushing the frame of a portrait a young woman with Devereux's eyes, her smile radiant yet tinged with melancholy. "The late Madame Devereux, I presume?" he said to Grayson, who was supervising the clearing of the table. "Yes, sir," the butler replied, his voice low. "She was the heart of this house. Her death changed everything." Poirot nodded, his mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle. A grieving widower, a vengeful rival, a scorned niece, a nervous composer, a sorrowful widow, and a ball that promised more than music. "Hastings," he said as they made their way to the ballroom, "this house is a labyrinth of motives. We must tread carefully, for the truth is a dangerous dance partner." Chapter 3. The waltz begins. The ballroom of Devereux Hall glowed like a jewel in the twilight, its vast expanse transformed into a stage of light and shadow. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, their prisms scattering rainbows across the polished parquet floor. Tall windows, framed by velvet drapes the color of midnight, opened onto a terrace where the sea's restless murmur mingled with the scent of roses from the garden below. The orchestra, a small but accomplished ensemble, tuned their instruments in a corner, the delicate notes of violins and cellos weaving a prelude to the evening's drama. Garlands of white lilies and ivy adorned the walls, their fragrance delicate yet pervasive, and silver candelabras cast a warm, flickering glow over tables laden with champagne flutes and delicate pastries. Hercule Poirot stood near the entrance, his small, immaculate figure a study in elegance. His evening suit, tailored to perfection, gleamed under the chandelier light, and his mustache, waxed to a precise curve, seemed to quiver with anticipation. Beside him, Captain Hastings adjusted his tie, his honest face betraying a mix of excitement and unease. "Quite a show, a Poirot," he said, surveying the room. "You'd think we were at Buckingham Palace, not some old pile in Sussex." "Nan, Hastings," Poirot replied, his green eyes scanning the crowd with the intensity of a hawk. This is no mere palace. It is a theatre, and tonight the players perform for stakes we cannot yet see." His voice was soft, but there was a steel beneath it, a certainty that this glittering assembly concealed a darker purpose. The guests began to arrive, their entrance a procession of silk and jewels. Claire Beaumont was the first to cross the threshold, her midnight blue gown shimmering as she moved. Her posture was rigid, her chin lifted in defiance. But Poirot noted the way her fingers clutched her fan, the knuckles white with tension. The locket at her throat, engraved with the initials AD, caught the light, and her eyes darted toward the ballroom center, as if seeking someone or avoiding them. Sir Reginald Holt followed, his broad frame filling the doorway. His laughter boomed across the room, but his eyes, cold and calculating, lingered on the other guests with a predator's focus. His silver-topped cane tapped the floor rhythmically, a sound that seemed to echo his authority. Victor Langston slipped in next, his slight figure almost lost in the crowd. His dark hair fell into his eyes, and his hands trembled as he adjusted his cuffs, his gaze fixed on the orchestra with a mixture of pride and dread. Madame Elise Fournier entered last, a vision in black velvet, her movements graceful yet heavy, with an unspoken sorrow. Her lavender-scented gloves brushed against her skirt, and Poirot's nose twitched at the faint, familiar fragrance. Alphonse Devereux appeared at the top of the grand staircase, his presence commanding the room's attention. His silver hair gleamed, and his evening attire was impeccable, though Poirot noted again the slight tremor in his hand as he raised a glass of champagne. "My friends," he said, his voice resonant yet tinged with an emotion Poirot could not quite place. "Tonight we celebrate the beauty of life, the rhythm of the heart. Let the music guide us, and may truth dance with us all." The words were gracious, but there was a weight to them, a hint of foreboding that sent a ripple of silence through the room. The orchestra struck up a Viennese waltz, its lilting melody filling the air with an intoxicating grace. Couples took to the floor, their movements a swirl of color and motion. Claire paired with Sir Reginald, though her steps were stiff, her smile forced, as if the act of dancing with him was a duty rather than a pleasure. Victor lingered near the orchestra, his eyes following the conductor's baton, while Madame Fournier stood by a window, her gaze fixed on Devereux with an intensity that intrigued Poirot. The financier himself did not dance at first, instead moving among the guests, his charm polished but his eyes watchful. Poirot, positioned near a marble pillar, observed the scene with the precision of a chess master. "Regard us, Hastings," he murmured, gesturing subtly toward Claire. "She dances, but her heart is elsewhere. And Sir Reginald, his laughter is a mask, Nan. He watches our host like a man who has lost a fortune and seeks to reclaim it." Hastings, sipping champagne, nodded. "And young Langston looks like he's about to bolt. What's got him so jumpy?" "Perhaps the music," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing as he watched Victor. "Or perhaps something more. The boy is nervous, but not without purpose. And Madame Fournier, her sorrow is real, but there is something else. A determination, Pater." The waltz reached a crescendo, the music soaring as the dancers spun faster. Poirot's gaze shifted to Devereux, who now took the floor alone. His movements were graceful, almost ethereal, as if he danced with a partner only he could see. The crowd parted, watching in silent awe, and Poirot felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. There was something final in Devereux's steps, a sense of inevitability that made the detective's heart quicken as the clock struck 10. The music paused, the last note hanging in the air like a held breath. Then a scream shattered the silence, sharp and piercing, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. It came from Grayson, the butler, who stood at the edge of the ballroom, his face drained of colour. "Monsieur Devereux," he gasped, pointing to the centre of the floor. There, in the heart of the ballroom, Alphonse Devereux lay crumpled, his white shirt front stained with a spreading crimson bloom. The dancers froze, their faces a tableau of shock and horror. Poirot was at the body in an instant, his small frame moving with surprising speed. He knelt beside Devereux, his gloved fingers hovering over the wound, a single, precise stab to the heart. The financier's eyes were open, staring blankly at the chandelier above, and a faint smile lingered on his lips, as if he had seen his fate and accepted it. "Hastings, vite," Poirot called, his voice calm but urgent. "Secure the doors. No one leaves this room." Hastings, pale but resolute, moved to the entrance, his military training guiding his actions. The guests murmured, some stepping back, others pressing closer, their voices a cacophony of fear and suspicion. Poirot's eyes swept the scene, noting the details, the absence of a weapon, the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air, the way the chandelier's light cast eerie shadows across Devereux's face. "This is no accident," he said softly, more to himself than to Hastings. "This is a crime of passion, but also of calculation." He rose, his gaze moving to the guests. Claire stood rigid, her fan clutched to her chest, her eyes wide with shock, or was it guilt? Sir Reginald leaned heavily on his cane, his florid face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. Victor was trembling, his hands twisting together, while Madame Fournier's expression was unreadable, her black-gloved hands folded calmly before her. Grayson, still at the edge of the room, seemed rooted to the spot, his scar stark against his ashen skin. "Monsieur Poirot," Grayson stammered, stepping forward. What has happened?" "What has happened," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "is murder, and Hercule Poirot will find the truth." He turned to the guests, his eyes gleaming with purpose. "Madame et messieurs, remain where you are. The dance is over, but the investigation has just begun." The orchestra, silenced by the tragedy, stood motionless, their instruments forgotten. The ballroom, moments ago a place of elegance and joy, was now a crime scene, its beauty marred by the stain of blood. Poirot's mind raced, cataloguing every detail, the precise nature of the wound, the absence of the weapon, the lavender scent that seemed to cling to the air like a ghost. He knew that the truth lay hidden in the movements of the waltz, in the glances exchanged, in the secrets each guest carried, and he, Hercule Poirot, would unravel them all before the night was done. Chapter 4. The scene of the crime, the ballroom of Devereux Hall. Moments ago, a whirl of music and elegance had transformed into a frozen tableau of horror. The chandeliers still cast their golden glow, but the light now seemed harsh, illuminating the grim reality at the center of the parquet floor. Alphonse Devereux lay motionless, his white shirt front marred by a crimson stain that spread like an accusation. The guests stood in a loose semicircle, their faces a gallery of shock, fear, and suspicion, while the orchestra, silenced by the tragedy, clutched their instruments as if for comfort. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and the faint, lingering trace of lavender, a fragrance that tugged at Hercule Poirot's senses like a half-remembered clue. Poirot knelt beside the body, his small, precise figure a stark contrast to the chaos around him. His gloved hands hovered over Devereux's form, careful not to disturb the scene. The wound was a single, clean stab to the heart, delivered with surgical precision. No blood had pooled beneath the body, suggesting the blow had been swift and fatal. Poirot's green eyes narrowed as he noted the financier's expression, a faint, enigmatic smile, as if he had greeted death as an old friend. "C'est curieux," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "This is not a crime of impulse, but of design." Captain Hastings, standing guard at the ballroom's main entrance, looked pale but resolute. "Poison, perhaps, Poirot," he ventured, his voice low to avoid alarming the guests. "Or some sort of concealed blade." "None, Hastings," Poirot replied, rising to his feet with a grace that belied the gravity of the moment. "Poison leaves, traces convulsions, discoloration. This is a blade, sharp and true, but where is it?" He scanned the floor, his gaze sweeping the intricate parquet for any glint of metal, but found nothing. The lavender scent, faint yet persistent, drew his attention again, and he filed it away in the meticulous archive of his mind. Turning to the guests, Poirot raised a hand, his voice calm but commanding. "Madame, et messieurs, I must ask for your cooperation. A crime has been committed, and no one may leave this room until we have established certain facts. Monsieur Grayson, if you please, ensure the terrace doors are secured." The butler, his scar stark against his pallid face, nodded and moved to the tall windows, his steps hesitant but obedient. The guests murmured, their voices a low hum of protest and fear. Claire Beaumont stood rigid, her fan now dangling limply from her hand, her eyes fixed on the body with a mixture of horror and something deeper regret, perhaps. Sir Reginald Holt leaned heavily on his silver-topped cane, his florid complexion drained, though his eyes darted toward the exits as if calculating his chances of escape. Victor Langston, the young composer, was trembling visibly, his hands twisting together, his gaze flitting between the body and the orchestra as if seeking refuge in the familiar. Madame Elise Fournier, her black velvet gown absorbing the light, stood apart, her expression serene yet impenetrable, her lavender-gloved hands folded before her. Poirot addressed the group, his tone measured. "We must proceed with order. Each of you will provide an account of your movements during the waltz. Do not omit details, for it is in the small things that truth hides." He began with Claire Beaumont, who stepped forward, her chin lifted defiantly. "I was dancing," she said, her voice sharp but steady, "with Sir Reginald, as you saw. I never left the floor." Her eyes met Poirot's briefly before dropping to the locket at her throat, her fingers brushing it as if for reassurance. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "And you saw nothing unusual, mademoiselle? No one near Monsieur Devereux at the moment of his fall?" "Nothing," she said quickly. Too quickly, Poirot thought. It was all so sudden. The music stopped. And then, the scream. Sir Reginald cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "Same as the girl. I was dancing with her, trying to keep up with that blasted waltz. Didn't see a thing until Grayson shouted." He gripped his cane tightly, and Poirot noted the silver handle, its weight substantial but too blunt for the fatal wound. Victor Langston spoke next, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was by the orchestra, watching the conductor. Monsieur Devereux had asked me to ensure the music was perfect. I didn't see him fall." His hands shook, and he shoved them into his pockets, his eyes avoiding the body. Madame Fournier's response was calm, almost detached. "I was in the powder room, refreshing myself," she said, her French accent soft but clear. I returned just as the music stopped and heard the commotion. The scent of lavender was stronger as she spoke, and Poirot's nose twitched, his mind seizing on the detail. Grayson, when questioned, confirmed he had been stationed near the refreshment table, overseeing the staff. "I saw Monsieur Devereux dancing alone," he said, his voice steady but his eyes haunted. "Then he fell, and I called out." His scar seemed to pulse in the candlelight, and Poirot wondered what secrets it concealed. The detective paced slowly around the body, his steps deliberate, his eyes scanning every inch of the scene. The absence of the weapon was troubling, yet he knew it could not be far. A blade capable of such a wound, thin, sharp, perhaps a stiletto, would be difficult to conceal in evening attire. Yet none of the guests showed signs of carrying such a thing. He paused by the chandelier directly above Devereux's body, its crystals winking mockingly. Something about its position, its proximity to the crime, stirred his little grey cells. But the thought remained elusive. "Hastings, Poirot," said, beckoning his friend, "assist me in examining the floor. We seek a weapon, or perhaps a clue to its hiding place." Together, they combed the parquet, their movements careful to avoid disturbing the scene. The guests watched, some with curiosity, others with apprehension. Poirot's keen eyes noted a faint scratch near the body, barely visible against the polished wood, as if something sharp had grazed it. He knelt again, tracing the mark with a gloved finger. "Interesting," he murmured. "A blade, perhaps." Dropped in haste. Hastings, peering over his shoulder, frowned. "But where is it now? No one could have left the room." "Precisement," Poirot said, rising. "The weapon is here, hidden in plain sight. We must only know where to look." He turned his attention to the guests' alibis, testing their stories against the timeline of the waltz. The music had lasted precisely for minutes, Devereux dancing alone for the final 30 seconds before his collapse. The scream had followed, almost immediately, suggesting the act was committed in the fleeting moment when all eyes were on the financier's solitary performance. Poirot's mind raced, reconstructing the scene, the swirl of dancers, the distraction of the music, the opportunity for a swift, unseen strike. He approached the orchestra, who stood huddled in their corner, their faces pale. The conductor, a wiry man with a nervous tic, confirmed that the waltz had been uninterrupted until Devereux's fall. "He was dancing alone," the conductor said. "It was mesmerizing until it wasn't." Poirot requested the sheet music, noting Victor's anxious glance as it was handed over. The score was unremarkable, save for a series of faint pencil marks in the margin numbers, not musical notation. He tucked the paper into his pocket, his mind already turning over their significance. Returning to the guests, Poirot addressed them once more. "Mesdames et messieurs, I will speak with each of you privately. For now, please remain in the drawing room under Captain Hastings's supervision. Monsieur Grayson, ensure the staff are accounted for." As the guests filed out, their footsteps echoing in the now silent ballroom, Poirot lingered by Devereux's body. The lavender scent was stronger here, almost cloying, and he bent to examine the financier's hands. A faint residue, barely visible, clung to Devereux's cuff, a trace of powder, perhaps, or perfume. Poirot's lips curved into a slight smile. "The truth," he said softly, "is in the details." He stood, his gaze sweeping the room one final time. The chandelier loomed above, its crystals glinting like eyes, and the terrace windows rattled softly in the wind. Somewhere in this glittering cage, a killer had struck, and Poirot knew the key to their identity lay in the fleeting moments of the waltz. With a final glance at Devereux's serene face, he turned toward the drawing room, his little grey cells alight with purpose. The dance was over, but the hunt for truth had only begun. Chapter 5. The Niece's Secret. The drawing room of Devereux Hall, where the guests had been sequestered, was a sanctuary of sombre elegance. Its walls adorned with tapestries depicting pastoral scenes, now rendered eerie by the flickering firelight. The air was thick with tension, the guests seated in a semicircle of plush armchairs, their faces illuminated by the glow of a single candelabrum on the mantel. The faint scent of wax mingled with the ever-present lavender, a fragrance that seemed to follow Hercule Poirot like a persistent ghost. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the leaded windows and casting fleeting shadows that danced like spectres across the room. Poirot stood near the fireplace, his small, impeccable figure a beacon of calm amidst the storm of suspicion. His green eyes, sharp as cut emeralds, moved from one guest to another, noting the subtle tells of their unease. The way Claire Beaumont's fingers tightened around her fan, the restless tapping of Sir Reginald Holt's cane, the nervous twitching of Victor Langston's hands, and the serene yet impenetrable composure of Madame Elise Fournier. Captain Hastings stood by the door, his military bearing a quiet reassurance, ensuring no one left the room without Poirot's consent. The detective's first task was to unravel the threads of motive and opportunity, and he chose to begin with Claire Beaumont, the estranged niece whose defiance masked a deeper turmoil. He gestured to a small alcove at the far end of the room, where a velvet curtain offered a semblance of privacy. "Mademoiselle Beaumont," he said, his voice soft but authoritative, "if you would be so kind as to join me." Claire rose, her movements stiff, her midnight blue gown rustling like whispers of discontent. She followed Poirot to the alcove, her chin lifted, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of apprehension. As they sat across from each other at a small mahogany table, Poirot adjusted his cufflinks, his manner deliberate, designed to set her at ease while keeping her on edge. "Mademoiselle," he began, his tone gentle yet probing, "you have told me you were dancing with Sir Reginald when your uncle fell. Yet I sense there is more to your story. What is it you conceal?" Claire's lips parted, then closed, her fingers brushing the locket at her throat, a gesture Poirot had noted. "Before, I've told you everything," she said, her voice sharp. "I was on the dance floor. I saw nothing until Grayson screamed. What more do you want?" "The truth," Mademoiselle Poirot replied, his eyes fixed on hers. "It is a simple thing, yet so often hidden. Your uncle, Monsieur Devereux, spoke of you as estranged." "Why?" Her expression hardened, but a tremor passed through her hands. "He was a tyrant," she said, her voice low, almost a hiss. "He cut me off years ago, after my parents died, said I was reckless, unfit to carry the family name. I've made my own way since then, but he never forgave me for defying him." Poirot tilted his head, his mustache twitching slightly. "And yet he invited you to this ball. Why, mademoiselle? Did he seek reconciliation?" Claire's eyes dropped to the locket, her fingers tracing its engraved initials. "He sent me a letter," she admitted, her voice softer now. "A month ago. He said he wanted to make amends, to restore what was taken from me. But when I arrived, he was cold, distant. It was as if the letter was a lie, a cruel trick to bring me here." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "This letter, mademoiselle, do you have it?" She hesitated, then reached into a small reticule at her side, producing a folded sheet of paper. It was written in Devereux's distinctive hand, the ink as black as the invitation Poirot had received. The words were conciliatory, promising a renewed bond, yet there was a formality to them that struck Poirot as calculated. "And when you spoke with him tonight," he asked, "did he confirm this intention?" "No," Claire said, her voice bitter. "He barely acknowledged me at dinner. He was more interested in his precious ball, his music, his legacy." The last word was spat with venom, and Poirot noted the flush that rose to her cheeks. The detective's eyes lingered on the locket, its silver surface catching the candlelight. "This locket, mademoiselle, it is significant, Nan. The initials AD, they are for your uncle." Claire's hand closed over the locket, protective, almost possessive. "It was my mother's," she said quickly. "She was his sister. It's all I have left of her." Poirot nodded, but his mind was already turning over the discrepancy. The locket's design was modern, its craftsmanship too recent to belong to a generation past. He did not press the point, instead shifting his approach. During the waltz, "Mademoiselle, you were near the center of the ballroom. Did you see anyone approach your uncle as he danced alone?" Her eyes flickered, a momentary hesitation that Poirot caught like a moth in a net. "No," she said, her voice firm. "It was crowded. Everyone was moving. I was focused on Sir Reginald, trying not to step on his feet." Poirot smiled faintly, a gesture that concealed the rapid workings of his little grey cells. "Mercy. Mademoiselle, you have been most helpful. For now, you may return to the others." As Claire rejoined the group, Poirot remained in the alcove, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The letter, the locket, the bitterness in her voice all pointed to a wound deeper than mere estrangement. Claire Beaumont had a motive, perhaps. But had she the opportunity? The waltz had been a whirl of motion, yet Devereux's solitary dance had drawn all eyes. A strike in that moment would require audacity and precision, qualities Claire's demeanor suggested she possessed. Hastings approached, his brow furrowed. "Well, Poirot, did she spill anything useful, or is she just as prickly as she seems?" "Prickly, yes," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming, but also revealing. "The locket, Hastings, it is not what she claims. And the letter, it is a thread in a tapestry we have yet to fully see." He moved to the fireplace, where a portrait of the late Madame Devereux hung, her serene face a stark contrast to the tension in the room. The resemblance to Claire was subtle but unmistakable. The same sharp cheekbones, the same intensity in the eyes. Poirot's gaze lingered on the painting, his mind sifting through the fragments of the puzzle. "The family," he murmured. "It is always the family where secrets fester." Returning to the group, Poirot's attention shifted to the other guests, who sat in uneasy silence. Sir Reginald's impatience was palpable, his cane tapping a restless rhythm on the floor. Victor's eyes darted toward the door, as if longing to flee, while Madame Fournier's calm was a mask. Poirot itched to peel away. Grayson, stationed near a sideboard, watched the proceedings with a butler's detachment. Yet his scar seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "Monsieur Poirot," Sir Reginald said, his voice gruff, "how long must we sit here like suspects? In a penny dreadful? The man's dead, and we've told you what we know." "Patience, Sir Reginald," Poirot replied, his tone mild but firm. "The truth is like a fine wine, it requires time to breathe. I will speak with each of you in turn, and we shall see what lies beneath the surface of this tragic night." He gestured to the alcove again, his eyes settling on Victor Langston. "Monsieur Langston, if you please." The young composer rose, his movements jerky, his face pale as moonlight. As they moved to the alcove, Poirot's mind returned to Claire's locket, the letter, and the faint scent of lavender that seemed to weave through every corner of this mystery. The niece had a secret, of that he was certain, but whether it was the key to Devereux's murder remained to be seen. The dance of truth was far from over, and Hercule Poirot was determined to lead it to its final step. Chapter 6. The Rivals' Motive. The drawing room of Devereux Hall, with its heavy tapestries and flickering firelight, seemed to close in around the guests, the air thick with the weight of unspoken accusations. The candelabrum on the mantel cast long shadows that writhed across the walls, as if the house itself were conspiring to conceal its secrets. Hercule Poirot stood by the fireplace, his small, immaculate figure a beacon of order amidst the chaos of suspicion. His green eyes, sharp and unyielding, moved from one guest to another, cataloguing their tells: Claire Beaumont's rigid posture, Victor Langston's nervous fidgeting, Madame Elise, Fournier's enigmatic calm, and the restless energy of Sir Reginald Holt, whose silver-topped cane tapped an impatient rhythm on the polished floor. Poirot's mind was a whirl of observations, each detail a thread in the tapestry of Alphonse Devereux's murder. The precise stab wound, the missing blade, the lingering scent of lavender all pointed to a killer who had planned with care and struck with audacity. Having questioned Claire, whose bitterness and guarded locket hinted at hidden motives, now turned his attention to Sir Reginald Holt, the business rival whose booming voice and florid demeanor masked a deeper resentment. The detective gestured to the alcove where he had spoken with Claire, its velvet curtain offering a fragile veil of privacy. "Sir Reginald," he said, his voice smooth but commanding, "if you would indulge me with a moment of your time." Sir Reginald rose with a grunt, his broad frame filling the space as he leaned on his cane. His face, ruddy from years of good living, was pale now, though his eyes held a glint of defiance. He followed Poirot to the alcove, settling heavily into a chair, his cane resting across his knees like a scepter. "Well, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his tone gruff, "let's get this over with. I've nothing to hide, and I'm not one for sitting about while some foreign detective pokes into my affairs." Poirot's moustache twitched, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Your candor is refreshing, Sir Reginald, but it is not your affairs in general that interest MIT is your connection to Monsieur Devereux, and your movements during the waltz that ended so tragically." Sir Reginald's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the silver handle of his cane. "Devereux was a cheat," he said bluntly, his voice low but laced with venom. "He outmaneuvered me in a deal 10 years ago, Railways, South America. Cost me a fortune and my reputation in certain circles. The man had a knack for turning gold into ashes for anyone but himself." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And this loss, it has lingered. Nan, you bear him ill will." "Ill will?" Sir Reginald barked a laugh, though it lacked mirth. "I'd have happily seen him ruined, but murder, that's a fool's game, and I'm no fool. I've rebuilt my fortunes since then, no thanks to him. I came tonight because he invited me, said he wanted to bury the hatchet. Thought it might be amusing to see him grovel." Poirot's fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on the man's cane. Its silver handle, shaped like a lion's head, was heavy, ornate, but too blunt for the precise wound that had felled Devereux. Still, he noted its weight, the way Sir Reginald's hand rested on it with possessive ease. "And during the waltz," Poirot said, You were dancing with Mademoiselle Beaumont, as you stated. You saw nothing unusual. Nothing, Sir Reginald said, his tone firm. The girl's a decent dancer, kept me busy enough. Devereux was prancing about on his own, showing off like some blasted peacock. Next thing I know, Grayson's yelling, and the man's dead on the floor. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. And your cane, Sir Reginald, is a fine piece. Heavy, perhaps, but not a weapon for stabbing, I think. Sir Reginald's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. What are you getting at? This cane's been with me for years. Family heirloom, not a murderer's tool. He lifted it, brandishing the silver head for emphasis, and Poirot noted the faint scratches on its surface, as if it had been used for more than support. Merci, Sir Reginald, Poirot said, his voice mild. You have been most forthcoming. For now, you may return to the others. As Sir Reginald rejoined the group, his cane tapping a defiant rhythm, Poirot remained in the alcove, his mind sifting through the man's words. The bitterness was genuine. The motive clear a decade-old grudge could fester into something darker, given the right provocation. Yet Sir Reginald's alibi, corroborated by Claire and a footman who had served him champagne, held for the moment. The cane, while suspicious, was not the murder weapon, but its scratches intrigued Poirot. Had it been used to conceal something, perhaps, or to distract? Hastings approached, his brow furrowed. He's a blustery sort, isn't he? Sounds like he hated Devereux's guts. But do you think he'd go as far as murder? Hatred, Hastings, Poirot said, his eyes gleaming, is a powerful engine, but it requires opportunity. Sir Reginald is a man of action, but also of calculation. If he struck, it would be with a plan, not a passion. Yet something in his manner. It is too loud, too obvious, Nan. Hastings shrugged. Maybe he's just rattled. Finding a chap stabbed in the middle of a ball would shake anyone. Perhaps, Poirot said, his gaze drifting to the fireplace, where the portrait of Madame Devereux gazed down with her serene, melancholy eyes. But in this house, nothing is as it seems. He returned to the group, his attention now drawn to the dynamics among the guests. Claire sat apart, her eyes fixed on the floor, her locket glinting in the firelight. Victor was hunched in his chair, his hands clasped tightly, as if anchoring himself against a storm. Madame Fournier's calm was unshaken, her lavender-gloved hands folded in her lap, though Poirot noted the faint tremor in her fingers when she reached for her glass of water. Grayson, ever the silent sentinel, stood by the sideboard, his scar a stark reminder of his own enigmatic presence. Poirot's thoughts returned to the crime scene, the single stab wound, the missing blade, the lavender scent that seemed to weave through every moment of this mystery. Sir Reginald's motive was clear, but his opportunity was less so. The waltz had been a chaos of movement, yet Devereux's solitary dance had drawn all eyes, making a public strike both daring and improbable. The killer, Poirot reasoned, had used the distraction of the music, the crowd, to act with precision. But how had the weapon vanished? He approached Grayson, who was arranging a tray of decanters with mechanical precision. Monsieur Grayson, Poirot said, his voice low, you were near the refreshment table during the waltz. Did you see Sir Reginald at any moment away from Mademoiselle Beaumont? The butler's eyes flickered, a brief shadow crossing his face. No, sir, he said, his voice steady. Sir Reginald was dancing, as he said. I was attending to the staff, ensuring the champagne was served. I saw nothing until the master fell. Poirot nodded, but his mind seized on the hesitation. However slight, Grayson's scar, his guarded demeanor, suggested a man with secrets of his own. And the staff, Poirot continued, they were all accounted for. Yes, sir, Grayson replied. I made certain of it. No one left their posts. Mercy, Poirot said, dismissing the butler with a nod. He turned back to the room, his little grey cells alight with possibilities. Sir Reginald's grudge was a motive, but not yet a solution. The scratches on the cane, the timing of the waltz, the elusive blade all, were pieces of a puzzle that refused to align. Yet Poirot knew that the truth was near, hidden in the shadows of Devereux Hall, waiting for his meticulous mind to bring it into the light. He gestured to the alcove once more, his eyes settling on Victor Langston. Monsieur Langston, he said, his voice soft but insistent, it is your turn. The young composer rose, his face pale, his steps faltering, and Poirot prepared to unravel another thread in the intricate dance of murder. Chapter 7. The composer's fear, the drawing room of Devereux Hall, with its heavy tapestries and flickering firelight, seemed to tighten its grip on the assembled guests, as if the walls themselves were complicit in the tragedy that had unfolded. The candelabrum on the mantel cast a wavering glow, its flames dancing in rhythm with the storm outside, where rain lashed the windows and the wind moaned like a mourner. Hercule Poirot stood by the fireplace, his small, fastidious figure a stark contrast to the undercurrent of dread that permeated the room. His green eyes, sharp and unrelenting, moved from face to face, noting the silent language of guilt and fear. Claire Beaumont's clenched hands, Sir Reginald Holt's restless cane, Madame Elise Fournier's enigmatic calm, and the trembling form of Victor Langston, the young composer whose nervous energy seemed to pulse with every tick of the ormolu clock. Captain Hastings stood by the door, his steady presence a bulwark against the rising tension, ensuring no one slipped away. Poirot's mind was a whirl of details. The precise stab wound that had felled Alphonse Devereux, the missing blade, the persistent scent of lavender that clung to the air like a whispered clue, Claire's guarded locket, and Sir Reginald. Bitter grudge had provided threads of motive, but the tapestry of the crime remained incomplete. Now, Poirot turned his attention to Victor Langston, whose pallor and trembling hands suggested a man on the edge of collapse. The detective gestured to the alcove, its velvet curtain offering a fragile shield from the prying eyes of the others. Monsieur Langston, he said, his voice soft but commanding, if you would be so kind. Victor rose, his movements jerky, as if his body were a marionette pulled by uncertain strings. His dark hair fell into his eyes, and he brushed it aside with a trembling hand, his gaze darting toward the door as if he longed to flee. He followed Poirot to the alcove, sinking into the chair with a sigh that was almost a sob. I don't know what you want from me, Monsieur Poirot, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't see anything. I was with the orchestra, that's all. Poirot seated himself opposite, his posture impeccable, his eyes fixed on the young man with the intensity of a surgeon's scalpel. Calm yourself, Monsieur Langston, he said, his tone soothing yet insistent. The truth requires clarity, and clarity requires composure. You were near the orchestra, you say, during the waltz, but your nerves, they betray you. What is it that you fear? Victor's hands twisted together, his knuckles white. I'm not afraid, he said, too quickly, his eyes avoiding Poirot's. It's a shock, that's all. Monsieur Devereux was kind to me, gave me a chance when no one else would. To see him like that, his voice broke, and he swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Poirot leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Kind, you say, and yet you tremble like a leaf in a storm. Tell me, Monsieur Langston, what was your connection to Monsieur Devereux? He commissioned a waltz from you, Nan, a special piece for this ball. Victor nodded, his eyes flickering to the sheet music Poirot had tucked into his pocket earlier. Yes, he asked me to compose something unique. He was very particular, said it had to be perfect, a tribute to his late wife. He called it his final performance. The last words were spoken with a shiver, and Poirot's mustache twitched at the phrase. Final performance, he repeated softly, a curious choice of words. And these numbers in the margin of your score 3, 7, 12, 19, what do they mean? They are not musical notation, I think. Victor's eyes widened, a flash of panic crossing his face. There, nothing, he stammered. Just notes, ideas for the tempo. I scribble things sometimes, to keep track. Poirot's smile was faint, almost pitying. Monsieur Langston, you are a poor liar. The truth, it is like a melody, must be played clearly, or it grates on the ear. These numbers, they are a code, Nan. A message, perhaps, or a direction. The composer's hands shook violently now, and he shoved them into his pockets, his shoulders hunching. I don't know what you mean, he said, his voice rising. I wrote the waltz, that's all. I didn't do anything wrong. Poirot's gaze softened, but his mind was relentless. I do not accuse you, monsieur, but fear, it is a heavy burden, and you carry it too openly. Tell me, during the waltz, you were by the orchestra. Did you see anyone approach Monsieur Devereux as he danced alone? Victor shook his head, his eyes fixed on the floor. No, I was watching the conductor, making sure the timing was right. The music was. It was everything to me tonight. I didn't see anything until Grayson shouted. Poirot nodded, his eyes lingering on the young man's trembling hands. And Monsieur Devereux, he spoke to you of this final performance. Did he seem troubled, anxious? Victor hesitated, his lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. He was intense, he said finally. He kept saying the waltz had to be perfect, that it was his legacy. He even came to my room last night, late, to go over the score. He seemed, I don't know, like he was saying goodbye. Poirot's eyebrows rose, a spark of interest igniting in his eyes. Goodbye, you say, and yet he invited you here, gave you this commission. Was there anything else he said? Anything unusual? Victor's gaze darted to the curtain, as if, fearing eavesdroppers, he mentioned something about making things right, he said, his voice barely audible. He said he'd wronged people, and this ball was his chance, too. To balance the scales. I thought he was just being dramatic. Poirot leaned back, his mind racing. Balance the scales, he murmured, a most suggestive phrase. He paused, then shifted his approach. Your score, Monsieur Langston, I will keep it for now. It may hold more than music, I think. Victor's face paled further, but he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Take it, he said. I've nothing to hide, merci. Poirot said, dismissing the young man with a nod. As Victor returned to the group, his steps unsteady, Poirot remained in the alcove, his fingers tracing the edges of the sheet music. The numbers 3, 7, 12, 19 were no random scribbles. They were deliberate, a cipher perhaps, or coordinates, to something hidden within the whole. Devereux's talk of a final performance and balancing the scales suggested a man preparing for an end. but whether by his own hand or another's remained unclear. Hastings approached, his brow furrowed. "That lad's a nervous wreck, Poirot. Looks like he's about to faint. Do you think he's mixed up in this?" "Mixed up, oui," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. "But guilty? That is another question. His fear is genuine, but it is not the fear of a killer. It is the fear of one who knows too much, too little. The score, Hastings, it is a key, but to what lock?" He glanced at the other guests, who sat in uneasy silence. Claire's eyes were fixed on her locket, her expression unreadable. Sir Reginald's cane tapped a restless beat, his impatience growing. Madame Fournier's calm was a mask, her lavender-gloved hands still in her lap, though Poirot noted the faint tightening of her jaw. Grayson, by the sideboard, watched with a butler's detachment, but his scar seemed to pulse in the firelight, a silent testament to his own mysteries. Poirot's thoughts returned to the crime scene, the single stab wound, the missing blade, the lavender scent that seemed to weave through every moment of this case. Victor's fear suggested he knew something, perhaps unwittingly, that tied him to Devereux's death. The numbers in the score were a clue, but their meaning eluded him for now. He needed more time, more pieces of the puzzle. He approached the fireplace, where the portrait of Madame Devereux gazed down, her serene face a reminder of the past that haunted this house. "The music," Poirot murmured, "it is the heart of this mystery. And Victor Langston, he is its composer, but not its master." He turned back to the group, his eyes settling on Madame Fournier. "Madame," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "it is your turn to speak with Hercule Poirot." The widow rose, her movements graceful but heavy, and Poirot prepared to probe the depths of her sorrow, knowing that the truth was drawing closer with every step. Chapter 8. The Widow's Sorrow. The drawing room of Devereux Hall, with its brooding tapestries and wavering firelight, seemed to pulse with the weight of unspoken truths. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling like a chorus of restless spirits, rattling the windows and casting jagged shadows across the room. The candelabrum on the mantel flickered, its flames struggling against the draught, as if mirroring the fragile composure of the guests. Hercule Poirot stood by the fireplace, his small, meticulous figure a pillar of calm in the sea of suspicion. His green eyes, sharp as polished jade, swept over the assembled company. Claire Beaumont's guarded stillness, Sir Reginald Holt's impatient scowl, Victor Langston's trembling unease, and the serene yet enigmatic presence of Madame Elise Fournier, whose black velvet gown seemed to absorb the light itself. Captain Hastings remained by the door, his steady gaze ensuring no one slipped away, his military discipline a quiet counterpoint to the growing tension. Poirot's mind was a whirl of details, the precise stab wound that had ended Alphonse Devereux's life, the elusive blade, the persistent scent of lavender that wove through the case like a haunting refrain, Claire's locket and hidden resentment, Sir Reginald's bitter grudge, and Victor's cryptic score had each added a thread to the tapestry of the crime, but the pattern remained incomplete. Now, Poirot turned his attention to Madame Fournier, the widow whose sorrow seemed to cloak a deeper truth. He gestured to the alcove, its velvet curtain a flimsy barrier against the scrutiny of the others. "Madame Fournier," he said, his voice soft yet commanding, "if you would honor me with a moment." Madame Fournier rose with a grace that belied the weight of her mourning attire. Her black-gloved hands smoothed her gown, and the faint scent of lavender trailed her as she moved to the alcove. settling into the chair with the poise of a woman accustomed to scrutiny. Her face, pale and composed, held a beauty tempered by grief, but her dark eyes met Poirot's with a steadiness that intrigued him. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her French accent soft but clear, "I will answer your questions, though I fear I have little to offer. This tragedy has left us all bereft." Poirot seated himself opposite, his posture impeccable, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "Madame," he began, his tone gentle but probing, "your sorrow is evident. And yet there is a strength in you, a clarity that suggests you see more than you reveal. Tell me, what was your connection to Monsieur Devereux?" Her lips parted, then closed, as if weighing her words. "He was my late husband's partner," she said finally, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Etienne and Alphonse built their empire together, shipping railways, ventures across the continent. When Etienne died 3 years ago, Alphonse was kind. He ensured I was cared for, though I asked for nothing. We corresponded, and he invited me here tonight, saying it was a chance to honor the past." Poirot's eyes narrowed, catching the slight hesitation in her words. "Honor the past, madame." And yet, Monsieur Devereux spoke of making amends, of balancing scales. Did he share such sentiments with you? Madame Fournier's fingers tightened briefly on her gloves, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by a less observant eye. "He did," she admitted, her voice softer now. "In his letters, he wrote of regrets, of things left undone. He said this ball was to be a celebration, but also a reckoning. I thought he meant to make peace with those he had wronged." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "And you, madame, had he wronged you?" Her eyes flickered, a shadow of pain crossing her face. "Not directly," she said, "but Etienne's death. It changed everything. Alphonse blamed himself, though he never said why. I believe he carried that guilt to his grave." Her voice caught, and she looked away, her composure faltering for the first time. Poirot noted the tremor, the way her hands clasped together, the lavender scent that seemed stronger now, as if it were an extension of her presence. "During the waltz, madame," he said, shifting his approach, "you told me you were in the powder room. Yet the scent of lavender, it was near Monsieur Devereux's body. How do you explain this?" Her eyes widened, a flash of alarm breaking through her calm. "Lavender," she said, her voice steadying with effort. "It is my perfume, yes, I use it often. It was Etienne's favorite. Perhaps it lingered in the ballroom from earlier, when I greeted Alphonse." Poirot's mustache twitched, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Perhaps," he said, his tone neutral. "And when you returned from the powder room, you saw nothing unusual? No one near Monsieur Devereux as he danced alone?" She shook her head, her gaze steady now. "No, Monsieur Poirot. I returned just as the music stopped. The crowd was still, and then Grayson's scream. It was all so sudden." Her voice was calm, but Poirot caught the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers brushed her gloves as if to anchor herself. He paused, his mind turning over her words. The lavender was no coincidence. It was a thread that tied her to the crime scene, however faintly. Her sorrow seemed genuine, but there was a calculation in her restraint, a sense that she was guarding something precious. "Madame," he said, his voice softening, "you spoke of Monsieur Devereux's guilt. Did he confide in you about his plans for this evening? A will, perhaps, or a gesture to right past wrongs?" Her eyes met his, and for a moment he saw a flicker of something, fear perhaps, or resolve. He mentioned no will, she said, only that he wished to make things right. He spoke of his niece, Claire, and of others he had hurt. I urged him to act before it was too late, but I did not know. I did not know it would end like this. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. Merci, madame. You have been most forthcoming. For now, you may return to the others. As Madame Fournier glided back to her seat, her black gown trailing. Like a shadow, Poirot remained in the alcove, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The widow's sorrow was real, but it was layered with something else, a purpose. Perhaps, or a secret she dared not reveal. The lavender scent, her absence during the critical moment of the waltz. Her knowledge of Devereux's regrets, or pointed to a connection deeper than she admitted. Yet her alibi, like the others, held for now, corroborated by the timing of the music and the testimony of a maid who had seen her in the powder room. Hastings approached, his brow furrowed. "She's a cool one, isn't she?" he said, keeping his voice low. "All that talk of grief, but she's steady as a rock. Do you think she's hiding something?" "Most certainly, Hastings," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. "Her sorrow is a veil, and behind it lies a truth she guards closely. The lavender, it is no mere perfume, is a clue, a thread that ties her to the crime. But whether she is the weaver or merely a strand, that is the question." He glanced at the other guests, their faces etched with strain. Claire's fingers toyed with her locket, her eyes distant. Sir Reginald's cane tapped an impatient rhythm, his scowl deepening. Victor sat hunched, his hands buried in his pockets, his fear palpable. Grayson, by the sideboard, watched with a butler's impassivity, but his scar seemed to pulse in the firelight, a silent marker of his own mysteries. Poirot's thoughts returned to the crime scene, the single, precise stab wound, the missing blade, the cryptic numbers in Victor's score. Madame Fournier's lavender was a piece of the puzzle, but it was not yet complete. Devereux's talk of amends, of balancing scales, suggested a man preparing to confront his past, but at what cost? The widow's composure, her careful words, hinted at a role in that confrontation. But whether as ally or adversary remained unclear. He approached the fireplace, where the portrait of Madame Devereux gazed down, her serene face a reminder of the past that haunted this house. "The heart," Poirot murmured, "it is the heart that drives this crime. And Madame Fournier, she knows more of it than she reveals." He turned back to the group, his eyes settling on Grayson. "Monsieur Grayson," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "I would speak with you now." The butler stiffened, his scar stark against his pale face, and Poirot prepared to probe the shadows of Devereux Hall, knowing that each step brought him closer to the truth. Chapter 9. The Hidden Blade. The drawing room of Devereux Hall, with its somber tapestries and flickering firelight, seemed to hold its breath as the storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a banshee against the leaded windows. The candelabrum on the mantel cast a wavering glow, its flames trembling as if in sympathy with the tension that gripped the room. Hercule Poirot stood by the fireplace, his small, impeccable figure a beacon of order in a sea of suspicion. His green eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept over the guests. Claire Beaumont's guarded silence, Sir Reginald Holt's restless impatience, Victor Langston's trembling unease, and Madame Elise Fournier's enigmatic calm, her lavender-gloved hands folded like a prayer. Captain Hastings stood sentinel by the door, his steady presence ensuring no one escaped the net of Poirot's scrutiny. The detective's mind was a whirl of details. The single, precise stab wound that had ended Alphonse Devereux's life. The elusive blade, the cryptic numbers in Victor's score, and the persistent scent of lavender that wove through the case like a haunting melody. Each guest had revealed a piece of the puzzle: Claire's hidden resentment, Sir Reginald's bitter grudge, Victor's fearful reticence, and Madame Fournier's guarded sorrow. Yet the heart of the mystery, the weapon itself, remained maddeningly out of reach. Poirot knew it could not be far. A blade capable of such a wound, thin and sharp, could not be easily concealed in evening attire, nor spirited away in the chaos of the waltz's final moments. He excused himself from the drawing room, beckoning Hastings to follow. "Mon ami," he said, his voice low but urgent, "we must return to the ballroom. The weapon is there, hidden in plain sight, and I will not rest until we find it." The ballroom, now silent and emptied of its revelers, was a ghostly echo of its former grandeur. The chandeliers still gleamed, but their light seemed colder, casting stark shadows across the parquet floor where Devereux's body had lain. The orchestra's instruments stood abandoned in their corner, and the garlands of lilies drooped as if in mourning. Poirot moved to the center of the room, where a faint chalk outline marked the spot of the crime, and knelt once more, his gloved fingers tracing the air above the floor. The scratch he had noted earlier, a hairline mark on the polished wood, caught his eye again, but it offered no further clues. "Hastings," he said, rising, "consider the scene. The waltz. It was a distraction, a moment of chaos. The killer struck as all eyes were on Monsieur Devereux, yet the blade vanished. Where could it go in such a moment?" Hastings frowned, scanning the room. Could someone have slipped it into a pocket, or tossed it out a window? Poirot shook his head, his moustache twitching. Nan, the windows were closed, and the terrace, doors guarded by Grayson's staff. A pocket, perhaps, but the risk of discovery would be great. No, the killer is cleverer than that. The blade is here, hidden where we least expect. His gaze lifted to the chandelier directly above the chalk outline, its crystals glinting like a constellation of secrets. Something about its position, its proximity to the crime, stirred his little grey cells. He approached it, his steps measured, and tilted his head to study its intricate design. The chandelier was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, its arms adorned with delicate filigree and clusters of crystals that shimmered in the light. But among the sparkling facets, something caught his eye glint that was not quite right, a shadow. "That did not belong. Hastings," he said, his voice sharp with excitement. "Fetch a chair, V." Hastings, though puzzled, complied, dragging a gilt chair from the edge of the room. Poirot climbed onto it with surprising agility, his small frame balanced precariously as he peered into the chandelier's heart. His gloved fingers probed among the crystals, careful not to disturb their arrangement, until they closed around a slender object nestled within the filigree. He drew it out with a triumphant flourish, a thin, ornamental dagger, its blade no longer than a letter opener, but wickedly sharp, its tip stained with a faint trace of blood. "Voila!" Poirot exclaimed, descending from the chair and holding the dagger aloft. The hidden blade, concealed in the very light that illuminated the crime. Hastings's eyes widened. "Good Lord, Poirot, right above the body. That's diabolical." "Precisement," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. The killer used the chandelier as a hiding place, knowing it would be overlooked in the chaos. The waltz, the crowd, the sudden scream, all were part of the design. But who could reach such a height in a moment? He examined the dagger closely, noting its delicate handle. engraved with the same Roseanne serpent crests that adorned Devereux. Stationary. "This is no common weapon," he said. "It is from the house, perhaps from the study. Only someone familiar with Devereux's possessions would know of it." Hastings scratched his head. "But how did they get it up there?" "The chandeliers, a good 10 feet off the ground." Poirot's gaze returned to the chandelier, his mind reconstructing the scene. A swift motion, perhaps, during the distraction of the waltz's end. A toss, guided by skill or desperation. Or, he paused, his eyes narrowing. A tool. Perhaps, to extend the reach. "We must search further." They scoured the ballroom, examining the refreshment table, the orchestra's corner, the terrace doors. Poirot's attention was drawn to a small pile of discarded garlands near the windows, their lilies wilting in the dim light. He knelt, sifting through the flowers, and found a slender rod of polished wood, no thicker than a conductor's baton, but sturdy enough to serve as a makeshift pole. "This," he said, holding it up, "could have been used to place the dagger. In the chandelier, it is light, discreet, easily discarded among the decorations." Hastings nodded, his expression grim. "So the killer planned this down to the last detail. But who, Poirot? They were all dancing, or accounted for, not?" "All," Poirot said, his voice soft but resolute. "Madame Fournier was in the powder room, or so she claims. And Grayson, he was near the refreshment table, but his eyes were elsewhere. We must return to the drawing room and test their stories further." They re-entered the drawing room, the dagger and rod carefully wrapped in Poirot's handkerchief. The guests stirred at their return, their faces a mixture of curiosity and dread. Poirot held the dagger aloft, its blood-stained tip catching the firelight. "Madame et messieurs," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "The weapon has been found, hidden in the chandelier above Monsieur Devereux's body. It is a blade from this house, known to someone intimate with its secrets. Who among you can explain this?" A gasp rippled through the room. Claire's hand flew to her locket, her eyes wide. Sir Reginald's cane paused mid-tap, his face pulling. Victor shrank back, his hands trembling, while Madame Fournier's calm faltered, her lavender-gloved fingers tightening in her lap. Grayson, by the sideboard, stiffened, his scar stark against his ashen skin. Poirot's gaze moved to Grayson. "Monsieur Grayson," he said, "you have access to the study, where such a dagger might be kept. Did you see it tonight?" The butler shook his head, his voice steady but strained. "No, sir. The study is locked when not in use. Only the master and I have keys, and I was at my post all evening." Poirot nodded, his mind racing. The dagger's presence in the chandelier suggested a killer with intimate knowledge of the house, but also one with the audacity to act in a crowded room. The rod, discarded among the garlands, pointed to a plan both bold and meticulous. He turned to the guests, his eyes gleaming with purpose. "The blade is found," he said, "but the hand that wielded it remains hidden. I will speak with each of you again, and the truth will not elude Hercule Poirot." He gestured to the alcove, his gaze settling on Grayson. "Monsieur Grayson, you will go first." The butler nodded, his scar pulsing in the firelight, and Poirot prepared to unravel the next thread in the intricate dance of murder, knowing that each step brought him closer to the killer's identity. Chapter 10. The Code unraveled the drawing room of Devereux Hall, with its heavy tapestries and flickering firelight, seemed to close in on its occupants, the air thick with the weight of suspicion and secrets. The storm outside raged on, its howling winds and lashing rain a fitting chorus to the tragedy within. The candelabrum on the mantel cast trembling shadows, as if the house itself were uneasy, its walls guarding truths that Hercule Poirot was determined to uncover. The detective stood by the fireplace, his small, meticulous figure a beacon of order in the chaos of murder. His green eyes, sharp as polished gems, swept over the guests. Claire Beaumont's guarded stillness, Sir Reginald Holt's impatient scowl, Victor Langston's trembling unease, and Madame Elise Fournier's enigmatic calm. Her lavender-gloved hands folded like a shield dot. Captain Hastings stood by the door, his military bearing a quiet assurance that no one would slip away. Poirot's mind was a whirlwind of details, the precise stab wound that had ended Alphonse Devereux's life, the ornamental dagger found hidden in the chandelier, the slender rod discarded among the garlands, and the persistent scent of lavender that wove through the case like a haunting thread. The interviews had revealed motives and tensions, Claire's hidden resentment, Sir Reginald's bitter grudge, Victor's fearful reticence, and Madame Fournier's guarded sorrow. The discovery of the dagger had tightened the net, but the killer's identity remained elusive. Now, Poirot's attention turned to the cryptic numbers in Victor's score 3, 7, 12, 19, a clue that promised to unlock a deeper truth. He excused himself from the drawing room, beckoning Hastings to follow. "Mon ami," he said, his voice low but charged with purpose, "we must return to the study. The numbers in Monsieur Langston's score are no mere scribbles. They are a code, and I believe they point to something hidden within this house." The study, with its leather-bound books and massive oak desk, was a sanctuary of intellect and secrets. The bronze statuette of a dancer, frozen mid-waltz, gleamed in the lamplight, and the portrait of Madame Devereux gazed down from above the fireplace, her serene face a silent witness. Poirot moved to the desk, where he had noted a collection of papers and artifacts during his earlier visit with Devereux. His gloved fingers sifted through the items, pausing on a locked drawer that seemed to hum with significance. "Hastings," he said, his eyes gleaming, "the numbers 3, 7, 12, 19, they are not random. They suggest a sequence, perhaps coordinates, or a combination. We must find what they unlock." Hastings, peering over his shoulder, frowned. "A safe, perhaps." Devereux was a financier bound to have one stashed somewhere. "Precisement," Poirot said, his gaze sweeping the room. His eyes settled on the portrait of Madame Devereux, its heavy gilt frame slightly askew, as if disturbed by a careless hand. He approached it, his fingers tracing the edges, and felt a faint catch-a hidden hinge. With a gentle push, the portrait swung outward, revealing a small wall safe embedded in the stone. Its dial gleamed, and Poirot's heart quickened. "Voila," he murmured, "the lock that awaits our key." He turned the dial, entering the numbers 3, 7, 12, 19 in sequence. A soft click echoed in the silent study, and the safe door swung open. Inside was a single document, its paper crisp and new, sealed with the Roseanne serpent crest. Poirot extracted it with care, breaking the seal to reveal a will dated only 3 days prior. The text was concise, naming Claire Beaumont as Devereux's sole heir, a stark reversal of her earlier disinheritance. A codicil noted that the estate, including Devereux Hall and its considerable wealth, would pass to her upon his death, with provisions for a charitable trust in memory of his late wife. Poirot's moustache twitched, a triumphant smile playing at his lips. "This, Hastings," he said, holding up the document, "is the motive. Monsieur Devereux intended to right a wrong, but in doing so, He stirred a nest of vipers. Hastings' eyes widened. Claire's the heir. But she said he was cold to her, that his promise of reconciliation was a lie. Perhaps it was, Poirot said, his voice soft but resolute. Or perhaps someone else knew of this will and sought to prevent its execution. The question is who? He returned to the drawing room, the will tucked securely in his pocket, his mind racing with possibilities. The guests stirred at his entrance, their faces etched with strain. Poirot's gaze moved to Grayson, the butler, whose scar seemed to pulse in the firelight. "Monsieur Grayson," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "you have access to the study. Did you know of a new will drawn by Monsieur Devereux?" Grayson stiffened, his eyes flickering with unease. "No, sir," he said, his voice steady but strained. "The master kept his private papers locked away. I only entered the study to deliver his correspondence or to clean." Poirot nodded, but his mind seized on the butler's hesitation. "And yet," he said, "you overheard him speak of making amends, did you not? Perhaps with Madame Fournier." Grayson's scar twitched, a subtle tell. "I may have heard him mention something to Madame Fournier," he admitted. "A week ago, in the study, he said he was changing his affairs, setting things right. I thought it was about the ball." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Merci, Monsieur Grayson. You have been most helpful." He turned to the group, his gaze settling on Madame Fournier. "Madame," he said, "you spoke of Monsieur Devereux's desire to make amends. Did he confide in you about this will?" Her lavender-gloved hands tightened in her lap, her composure faltering for a moment. "He mentioned a change," she said, her voice low. "He said he wished to honor his niece, to restore what was taken from her. I urged him to act quickly, but I did not see the document." Poirot's mind raced, piecing together the fragments. The will, hidden behind the portrait, suggested Devereux's intent to reveal it at the ball, perhaps as part of his reckoning. But someone had known, someone who could not allow Claire to inherit. The dagger, the lavender, the numbers in the squirrel pointed to a killer with intimate knowledge of the house and its master's plans. He approached the fireplace, where Madame Devereux's portrait gazed down, her eyes seeming to follow him. "The code," he murmured. It was Devereux's final act, a message to ensure his wishes were known. But the killer, they sought to silence it. Hastings, standing nearby, whispered, "So the murderer knew about the will. That narrows it down, doesn't it? Claire, Madame Fournier, maybe Grayson." "Perhaps," Poirot said, his eyes narrowing. "But the truth is a dance, Hastings, and we have not yet found its rhythm." He turned back to the guests, his voice firm. "Madame et messieurs, the net tightens. A will has been found, naming Mademoiselle Beaumont as heir. Someone in this room knew of it, and that knowledge drove a blade into Monsieur Heart." A murmur rippled through the group, Claire's eyes widening, Sir Reginald's cane pausing mid-tap, Victor's hands trembling, and Madame Fournier's face piling beneath her column. Poirot's gaze lingered on each, his little grey cells alight with purpose. The code was unraveled, but the killer's identity remained a shadow, waiting to be brought into the light. Chapter 11. The confrontation. The drawing room of Devereux Hall, steeped in the glow of the candelabrum and the restless flicker of firelight, seemed to hold its breath as the storm outside battered the ancient walls. The tapestries, heavy with the weight of history, absorbed the tension that pulsed among the guests, their faces etched with fear, defiance, and guarded secrets. Hercule Poirot stood at the center of the room, his small, immaculate figure commanding attention like a maestro before an orchestra. His green eyes, sharp as polished blades, swept over the assembly. Claire Beaumont, her fingers clutching her locket. Sir Reginald Holt, his cane stilled but his scowl deepening. Victor Langston, trembling like a leaf in the wind. And Madame Elise Fournier, her lavender-gloved hands folded but her composure fraying at the edges. Grayson, the butler, stood by the sideboard, his scar stark against his pale face, his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. Captain Hastings remained by the door, his steady presence a silent assurance that no one would escape Poirot's scrutiny. The detective's mind was a whirlwind of details: the single stab wound that had felled Alphonse Devereux, the ornamental dagger hidden in the chandelier, the slender rod discarded among the garlands, the cryptic numbers in Victor's score, and the newly discovered will naming Claire as heir. Each piece of the puzzle had brought him closer to the truth. And now, with the net tightening, Poirot was ready to draw the killer from the shadows. He stepped forward, his voice clear and resonant, cutting through the murmur of the storm. "Madame et messieurs," he began, his tone calm but unyielding. "The murder of Monsieur Alphonse Devereux was no act of impulse. It was a waltz of deceit, choreographed with precision to silence a man who sought to right his wrongs. The weapon, a dagger from this very house, was hidden in the chandelier, a bold stroke of ingenuity. The will, concealed behind a portrait, named Mademoiselle Beaumont as heir, a motive that stirred the heart of a killer. And the scent of lavender. It weaves through this crime like a melody, pointing to one among you." A gasp rippled through the room, the guests shifting in their seats. Claire's hand tightened on her locket, her eyes wide with shock. Sir Reginald's jaw clenched, his cane gripping the floor. Victor shrank back, his hands twisting in his lap, while Madame Fournier's serene mask cracked, her lips parting, as if to speak. Grayson's scar pulsed, his posture rigid. Poirot's gaze settled on Madame Fournier, his eyes piercing. "Madame," he said, his voice soft but relentless, "your lavender gloves, they betray you. The scent was near Monsieur Devereux's body, stronger than a mere trace from earlier in the evening. You were not in the powder room, as you claimed, but in the ballroom, near the chandelier, where you hid the dagger after striking the fatal blow." Madame Fournier's face crumpled, a single tear tracing her cheek. The room fell silent, the only sound the howl of the wind outside. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "you are mistaken. I loved Alphonse, not as a lover, but as a friend who carried my husband's memory. I would never harm him." Poirot raised a hand, his expression unyielding. "Love, madame, can be a motive as powerful as hate. You knew of the will, did you not? Monsieur Devereux confided in you, spoke of restoring Mademoiselle Beaumont's inheritance. But this act threatened another promise, a charitable trust. In your late husband's name, a legacy you cherished above all else." Her eyes widened, a flash of panic breaking through her calm. How did you know?" she whispered, her hands trembling in her lap. Poirot's mustache twitched, a faint smile of triumph. "The will, madame, it was clear. But your actions, they spoke louder. The lavender, it was no coincidence it marked your presence at the crime. The rod, discarded among the garlands, was your tool to place the dagger in the chandelier. Clever concealment. And your absence during the waltz's final moments, it was not to refresh, but to act, using the distraction of Monsieur Devereux's solitary dance to strike." Madame Fournier rose, her black gown pooling around her like a shadow. "You do not understand," she said, her voice breaking. "Alphonse promised me the trust would honor Etienne. It was all I had left of him. when he told me of the new will, giving everything to Claire, I panicked. She had forsaken him, defied him, yet he chose her over Etienne's memory. I couldn't let it happen. The room was a tableau of shock. Claire's hand flew to her mouth, her locket glinting in the firelight. Sir Reginald's scowl softened, replaced by disbelief. Victor's trembling ceased, his eyes wide with realization. Grayson stepped forward, his scar pulsing as if to intervene. But Poirot's raised hand stopped him. "Madame," Poirot said, his voice gentle but firm, "you took the dagger from the study, knowing its place among Devereux's possessions. You waited for the waltz's climax, when all eyes were on him, and struck with a precision born of desperation. Then, with the rod, you hid the blade in the chandelier, trusting the chaos to cover your act." Tears streamed down Madame Fournier's face now, her composure shattered. "I didn't mean to kill him," she sobbed. "I only wanted to stop the will, to make him see reason. But he turned, and the blade, it went too deep. I hid it, thinking I could escape, but I see now there is no escape." Poirot nodded, his eyes softening with a trace of pity. "The heart, madame, it leads us to dark places. You sought to protect a memory, but in doing so, you took a life." Hastings, his face pale, stepped forward. "Good Lord, Poirot, done it again. But how did you know it was her?" "The lavender, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice low. "It was too strong, too near the body. And her absence, her calm, they were a mask for a heart in turmoil. The will, the dagger, the..." Riddell pointed to one who knew the house and its master intimately. He turned to Grayson. "Monsieur Grayson, please summon the authorities. Madame Fournier will answer for her crime." As the butler moved to comply, his scar stark in the firelight, the guests sat in stunned silence. Claire's eyes were wet. Her locket clutched tightly. Sir Reginald's cane lay still, his anger replaced by resignation. Victor's trembling had eased, his fear giving way to relief. Madame Fournier sank back into her chair, her sobs quiet but unending. Poirot stood by the fireplace, the portrait of Madame Devereux gazing down, her serene face a reminder of the past that had driven this tragedy. "The dance is over," he said softly, more to himself than to the room. "But the truth, it always finds its rhythm." Chapter 12. Mysterious, the final note. The storm that had battered Devereux Hall throughout the night had subsided, leaving behind a heavy silence that seemed to cloak the house in mourning. The drawing room, once a stage for tension and suspicion, now felt hollow, its tapestries and firelight dimmed by the weight of tragedy. The candelabrum on the mantel flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the faces of the guests, who sat in stunned Shelter Island, stunned silence. Claire Beaumont clutched her locket, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. Sir Reginald Holt gripped his cane, his bluster subdued. Victor Langston sat with his head in his hands, the nervous energy drained from him. Madame Elise Fournier, her lavender gloves removed, sat with her hands folded, her face a mask of quiet defeat as Grayson stood by. Awaiting the arrival of the authorities, Hercule Poirot stood by the fireplace, his small, impeccable figure a beacon of resolve in the somber room. His green eyes, sharp and reflective, lingered on the portrait of Madame Devereux above the mantel, her serene gaze a silent witness to the unravelling of her husband's final act. Captain Hastings stood by the door, his steady presence a quiet anchor, his expression a mix of awe and sorrow as he watched Poirot orchestrate the final moments of the investigation. The detective stepped forward, his voice clear and measured, cutting through the heavy air. "Madame et messieurs," he said, his tone gentle yet resolute. "The mystery of Monsieur Devereux's death has been resolved. Madame Fournier has confessed to her crime, driven by a desperate desire to preserve a legacy she believed was threatened. The dagger, hidden in the chandelier, the rod discarded among the garlands, the scent of lavandel were threads in a tapestry of betrayal, woven with care and undone by the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot." A murmur rippled through the room, more of exhaustion than surprise. Claire's fingers tightened on her locket, her eyes fixed on the floor. Sir Reginald's cane lay still, his face etched with resignation. Victor's shoulders slumped, his fear replaced by a weary relief. Madame Fournier's gaze was distant. Her tears dried, but her composure shattered. Poirot turned to Grayson, who stood by the sideboard, his scar stark in the firelight. "Monsieur Grayson," he said, "please ensure Madame Fournier is escorted to a suitable room to await the authorities. They will arrive shortly." The butler nodded, his expression unreadable, and led Madame Fournier from the room with a gentle hand on her arm. The other guests remained seated, their silence heavy. With the weight of the revelation, Poirot's gaze returned to the portrait, his mind turning over the final pieces of the puzzle. "Hastings," he said softly, beckoning his friend, "this was a crime of the heart, not of greed or vengeance, but of love twisted into desperation. Madame Fournier sought to protect her husband's memory, but in doing so, she destroyed the man who shared it." Hastings approached, his face pale. "It's a terrible thing, Poirot." She seemed so composed. "How did you know it was her?" "The lavender, mon ami," Poirot replied, his mustache twitching slightly. "It was too strong near the body, a scent that lingered where it should not have. Her absence during the waltz's climax, her knowledge of the study's dagger, the rod used to hide it all, pointed to a woman who knew the house intimately and acted with calculated precision. But it was her sorrow, Hastings, that betrayed. Her sorrow, too deep to be innocent." Claire spoke at last, her voice barely a whisper. She took him from me. After everything, after all his promises." Her voice broke, and she clutched the locket, its silver surface catching the firelight. Poirot's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. "Mademoiselle, your uncle sought to make amends, to restore what was taken from you. The will, hidden behind the portrait, was his final act of reconciliation. But it came at a cost he could not foresee. Sir, Sir." Reginald cleared his throat, his voice gruff. The man was a fool to think he could control everyone. He should have known someone would take it too far. Victor looked up, his eyes haunted. "He kept talking about a final performance," he said. "I thought he was just being dramatic, but now it makes sense." Poirot nodded. He knew of the danger, perhaps. The ball, the waltz, it was his stage, and someone sought to end his performance. Madame Fournier could not allow his new will to stand, for it threatened her husband's legacy. The room fell silent again, the weight of the truth settling over them. Poirot approached the window, gazing out at the darkened gardens, where the rain had left a sheen of silver on the roses. "A sad affair," he murmured, more to himself than to Hastings. "The heart, it longs for what it cannot have, be it love, wealth, or redemption, and in its longing it destroys." Hastings stood beside him, his voice low. "What happens now, Poirot? The police will take her, and then what?" "Then, mon ami," Poirot said, turning to face him, "we leave this house of secrets and return to London. The truth has been served, and justice will follow. But the heart. He paused, his eyes lingering on the portrait of Madame Devereux. The heart, it will mourn. The room seemed to exhale, the tension easing as the guests processed the end of the drama. Poirot adjusted his hat, his movements precise, and stepped toward the door. "Come, Hastings," he said. "There is nothing more to be done. Reconstruction system and done. Ere the truth must be served." Hastings nodded, his expression a mix of relief and melancholy. "You're right, Poirot. It's a sad business, isn't it? All that scheming and planning, and in the end, it's just a tragic mess." Poirot's eyes softened, a rare moment of vulnerability. "Oui, mon ami Chalkistines, it is. But the heart, it is a complex thing. No, it can drive a man to ruin or a woman to murder." Hastings hesitated, then followed his friend out of the room. "I say, Poirot, do you think she was right about Devereux, that he meant to kill himself?" Poy Shackleton shook his head. "Nan, Hastings, Devereux was a man with demons. He meant to atone for his sins. No." Hastings frowned, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean, demons?" Poirot's moustache twitched, a faint smile appearing. "Demons are personal torments, Hastings. Things a man keeps locked away in his heart. Devereux was a man haunted by them." The detective's smile faded, and he turned to look at Hastings. "I see," he said, his tone gentle. "You're talking about guilt, aren't you, Hastings?" Nodded, his expression softening. "Guilt's a heavy thing, Poirot. It makes people do terrible things." Poirot's gaze returned to the drawing room, where the remaining guests sat in a subdued silence. "Oui," he said, "and it makes for a tragic end." He stepped toward the fireplace, his eyes on the portrait of Madame Devereux. "She was trying to protect her husband's memory," he said softly, "but in the end it destroyed them both." The room was quiet for a moment, the fire crackling softly in the background. Poirot turned to the group, his voice calm and measured. "Mesdames et messieurs, the truth has been revealed. Madame Fournier has admitted to the murder of Monsieur Devereux, driven by a desire to preserve her husband's legacy. The will, which favored her niece, was the motive for the crime. Hercule Poirot has unraveled the mystery." A murmur ran through the room, the guests shifting in their seats. Claire's eyes were wet, her locket clutched tightly in her hand. Sir Reginald leaned forward, his cane resting on the floor. Victor sat up, his expression one of stunned relief. Poirot stepped forward, the dagger in his hand. "This is the weapon," he said, holding it up. A small, ornate blade, hidden in the chandelier. A rod was used to place it there, no doubt to make it appear that Devereux stabbed himself. The guests gasped, their faces a mix of shock and fear. Madame Fournier's shoulders slumped, her composure crumbling. I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered. "I only wanted to stop him." Poirot's eyes softened, his voice gentle but firm. "Madame, you have committed a grave crime. The authorities will deal with you accordingly. But first, I must understand why." She looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. "To protect Etienne's legacy, the new will. It changed everything. I couldn't let her have it all." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "The will, madame, was the motive. You feared the loss of your husband's memory, a memory you cherished above all else." The room fell silent, the weight of the confession FP's fast-page speed confession settling over them like a shroud. Poirot turned to Hastings, his voice low. "Hastings, he said. You were right. It's a sad business. Hastings heartsick, his eyes on the portrait of Madame Devereux. Oui, mon ami, he said, and it makes for a tragic end. Poirot's gaze returned to the group, his tone measured. The heart, it is a complex thing, no. It can drive a man to ruin or a woman to murder. Hastings stepped forward, his expression softening. I say, Poirot, do you think she was right about Devereux? That he meant to kill himself? Shackleton shook his head. Nan, Hastings gone. The end.